I'm going to pass it over now to Vozgen. Vozgen's very special because he has a pretty long history at Central Bank, was involved in developing the prudent risk management approach to monetary policy, or what we call Mark II. Went through all the training, the intense training that we would put people through, effectively to join a 6-person team. We only have 6 people. We only have 6 people on the entire team that does everything: current analysis, projections, writing the monetary policy report, dealing with the board, and so on. But we also have 3 other teams that are training to get ready to replace the existing team. So Vozgen was on development, and then he went to production, and now he's the head of the monetary policy department. So I'm sure that he has some interesting perspectives to share with us. And after that, we will Anna, who is our very most recent student in the global forecasting school, and she'll say a few things that are that will add to what Vozgen is going to say, I believe.
Thanks, Doug, for this very kind introduction. And let me share my presentation first. I hope you see my screen very well. Yes, so it's my honor to be here today and present all this stuff to you. So in this platform, especially having these kind of very, very distinguished participants here. So as Doug also already set the floor, talking a lot about our new framework, the nuances, how and why we came from FPAS Mark 1 to the risk management approach and so on. I will particularly put much emphasis on the role of the team, because when you transform the decision making, like process, the mindset, how you make the decision, how you do the policy or current analysis and so on. So you have to also, at some point we understood that we have to also undergo a transformation in the organizational manner of our department, and also rethink the role of the staff under this new framework. So basically, what were the board expecting from us under the FPAS Mark 1 framework? I call it like to deliver certainty, like even in very uncertain times. So usually what the staff are doing is to go to do some analysis to cut the noise and deliver some exact answers to very, very difficult questions and so on. But as the uncertainty rose over the last couple of years, even becoming very, very structural, and especially we were going through the pandemic, like the wars, uncertainty about economic policies and so on, geopolitics and so on. So at some point we were understanding that this kind of approach is in some sense is useless, because in some points we were like trying to give much more certainty to the markets, the board and so on, but at the end of the day we were acknowledging that we are giving in some sense a false assurance to the markets rather than certainty. Under this new framework, we are mainly expected to highlight or to bring the main sources of uncertainties to the board. So in some sense, I can I can say that, we are expected to bring clarity about the sources of uncertainties. So what are the main sources? What are the causes? What are the conditional outcomes of this or that events, and so on? And rather than applying some deterministic approach to our current and policy analysis, now we doing much more like bringing some hypotheses, of course, with supporting data, facts, analysis, and so on to the board members, and they are putting their judgments rather than us like designing and bringing the baseline scenarios to the board. Basically, we were also, as we were doing some optimal policy under that framework, we were also doing some, bringing some either explicit or implicit policy recommendation to the board. But now we are not expected to do that. So what we are just doing is bringing the state-of-the-art analysis to the board members so that they can put their judgments and so that they can design their narratives about the scenarios and so on. And usually when we were bringing also the baseline to the board, to the discussions there, usually we were also facing some conflicts between the staff of the board, which is, I would say, very, very low probable under this scenario compared to the last one, to this framework, unlike our previous and here the stuff what the staff orientation is now is more of the helping the board, like the board members, to design their scenario narratives and evaluate some of them. As Doug already talked about, we are every quarter we construct and publish 2 illustrative scenarios, which are illustrative in their nature, rather than being like most probable or more probable or alternative scenarios. So they are illustrative in their nature. We take just a couple of scenarios, one which is a more inflationary scenario, the case A, as Doug already mentioned, which requires or assumes a scenario which requires a higher policy rate path than what the market currently expects, and another one that we call case B scenario, which assumes a scenario, more disinflationary scenario, which may require a lower policy rate path than what the currently the market expects. So we are in some sense helping the board to come up with their narratives, with their scenarios, and of course like evaluate some of them, rather than putting all of our efforts on the baseline projections that we were doing under the previous baseline, under the previous framework. So the frequency of the meetings with the board also rose under this new framework. So basically, we were meeting with the board only a few times during the production rounds under the last or the previous framework. But now we are meeting with the board every week. So we are meeting them on a weekly basis. We are having weekly monitoring meeting with the board, which is non-standardized meeting. So every time we come with some story, with some analysis of some part of the economy or some uncertainty, covering some source of uncertainty, and so on, having some discussions with the board members. And so we are heavily, so the board members are much more heavily engaged in all the processes now under this new framework, rather than under the FPAS Mark 1. So that's why we, in some sense, we might say that this framework is much more like board-oriented than the previous one. So having all these changes and transformations in our head, in mindset, and in the institutional changes and so on, We understood that we have to also adapt the monetary policy department. I mean, from the organizational perspective of view, we have to adapt this our department to these new challenges and to this new framework. So what we had under the last or previous framework was, I would say what typical like small to medium size like central bank might have. This is actually 3 to 4 to 5 unit department, which have very, very specialized economists there. For example, you have a division of external sector analysis and forecasting. So I was working in that division under the previous framework, and I was mainly responsible for the developments in the United States, like the global markets and so on. I was doing forecasting in terms of the global developments and so on. That was my primary job and responsibility under that framework. So we had like another specialist, for example, mainly working on the demand side of the economy in our real sector analysis division, another specialist working mainly on the supply side. So it is very, very much, it was specialized. But under this new framework and under these new challenges as the uncertainty rose also, we saw the, how to say, like to transform from specializations to much more of a versatile or generalistic approach to policy making. So what we have now is that we have a very, very flat structure. We have 4 teams in our department which are not fixed at all. So they are rotating every quarter, and the specialists or our policy experts are rotating both within the teams and inside the teams. So every year we might shape these 4 teams, changing them and so on. But also they are rotating inside the team, so that we are ensured that they are covering all the important aspects of the economy. For example, one period, one economist might be covering like the fiscal policy. Another period, he or she might move to, I don't know, the financial sector analysis, the real sector, I don't know. So that in some period of time, the macroeconomist in our department is able to cover all the stuff and is a generalist. So we might cover everything. That's why this is one of the reasons that I think we are able now to cover all this production round and so on by only one team consisting of 6 members. So every quarter, only one team is responsible for the production of all the processes. I mean, both the communication tools, the materials, the NPR, all the stuff, communicating with the board. And so on. And then the next quarter, this team rotates to become into like research and development, the heavy trainings and so on, so that we are also ensured that these team members are also going deeper and deeper into research, so that they are not not staying shallow. Let me say that. So usually what we are comparing our new team structure is the basic, like the volleyball team. Let me go into the sports analogy of this. For example, comparing the football or as you call it in America, like soccer, with the volleyball game. So under the soccer game, usually you have some players that have very, very specific roles and specific positions in the field. For example, they are offensive players or defenders or the goalkeeper and so on. But under the volleyball game, by the way, they also have 6 players in a team. They rotate clockwise every time they win the opponent's serve. So they have to be, every player in this volleyball game has to be good at any position in the field. So they have to be good at the net, like offending, or they have to be good at serving the ball. They have to be good at playing at the net, and so on. So after some rounds, all the players has already have some experience playing on every positions, and so on. So this is what we call this kind of the generalistic approach, and we employ it under this new framework. And maybe that's one of the most important changes that we undergo, and which led us also to cover all the stuff that we need to do. So what the team like is expected to produce under this new framework is that generally speaking, like everything the board sees, also the public sees under this new framework. So we very much value the transparency. I think that's the most important, I think, key maybe thing under this rising uncertainty, rather than going into like a secretive manner and so on. So what we generally produce is that we are producing, of course, the press release and the executive monetary policy statement after the board, just after the board decision. And if we go by the timeline, it is like the 12 o'clock that we publish that. And then we have a press conference and a presentation to the general audience that the chair gives. And then by the end of the day, on 6 p.m., we generally publish everything that we have. So the transparency report, where we have the attributed minutes of the board meeting, and we have also the final submissions of the individual board members. So each board members gives some rational, his perspectives and the risks that he wants to escape or control, and so on. So we publish also all their final submissions. We also publish the monetary policy outlook. I mean, this is the presentation, the final deliberations presentation that we give, that we present to the board. So we also publish that. Of course, the monetary policy report with their corresponding graphs and tables and MPR chart pack. So generally, we publish like everything there. And a day after the decision, we are also having, we usually we have a technical briefing with the analysts, also elaborating more, maybe some technical stuff also with the market participants on our scenarios, and so on. So generally, that was what I wanted to talk about. And let me give the floor to
Hey,
Doug.
I just thought, so we make it a bit more dynamic before we move to Anna, because I'm sure Charles might have some questions, like how is it possible to do this with six people? Because, you know, in many institutions where you have all these specialized people, you know, the teams are gigantic, and what comes with that specialization are some very important communication issues between members of the team. So when I first learned this stuff at the Bank of Canada, we were specialists, and we would apply add factors to equations to build up the forecast and so on. And of course, the model was terrible, which meant that there were tremendous amounts of judgment that needed to be done. And to do that, you needed enormous amounts of coordination and so on. So I think you need to explain, why is it possible to do this with six people much better than with a large number of people. So I would say, even if I had a lot of resources, I would still have them maybe being experts in particular areas, but you still only need six people to actually do the whole process in the most efficient way. Second, we have AI coming now. And the AI, in terms of the organization of monetary policy processes and how they're produced, is going to change the world totally. And it also points to maybe even smaller numbers than 6 people. You might only need two or three really seasoned people. But then the question is where to get the 2 or 3. So I think, Foz, you need to maybe explain a little bit more to Charlie. How is this, Charlie in the outside world, how is this possible to do this better? Not, with 6 people in a rotational system where these other people are actually contributing to the projection, or they're developing to be better members of the 6 person team once they're selected to do it, because it just sounds it must be a little shocking for people like Charlie and others to hear that that only 6 staff are heavily involved in the process.
Well,
Yeah.
hey, Doug, could I interject here?
Please, yeah, please.
Because I think your question is a good one. I mean, those are very sensible reactions. It seems to me, and so I like your description a lot about with the Bank of Canada, you had a large model, you had ad factors, you had people who were tweaking them and tamping things down if they weren't working right. Earlier in the discussion, somebody mentioned that, wow, some of these charts are analyses are just way more complicated than policymakers want to have to sift through, and the public won't be able to understand it. So some focus on what's digestible, what's simple, what's enough. Can 6 people do it? I can understand that. I look forward to hearing about that. It does seem, though, I mean, there's a long history of forecasting and statistics where, like, a random walk model beats, big models, beats a lot of, different kind of models. And so a big question is always, I might do better forecasting, but will I understand what's in play in the uncertainties and the risks? And it seems like you have a lot of that covered with your FPAS and all of that. And so I'm going to look forward to commentary about how 6 well-versed analysts can hit the key points in a way that make the policymakers understand what they're facing and come up with the best ideas. But those are just some additional thoughts that came to mind as you were describing this.
And Armen, please, if you would like to engage at any time, because questions like this, Armen he goes back so far that he was actually in charge, or one of the key people developing FPAS Work 1. And now, of course, he's the deputy governor of the Central Bank of Armenia. So he might he'll have a broader perspective than even Voskin. So please, Voskin, Armen.
Thanks, Doug. Maybe I'll let me just pick it up from the place that Charles has left, because I think there are a couple of important points to make in terms of the what do we understand when what do we mean when we talk about good monetary policy. I think that's an important question, and then from there we'll see what is needed really, what work is really needed to be done by the staff and how to do it in an effective way. First, I thought the point about the random walk and forecasting, I thought that was a very good point, because I think the very first point that anybody has to recognize, is certainly in my opinion, it's that good monetary policy is not about having a good forecast. I think that's not the most important thing. I have seen many cases that good central banks have actually fallen into this trap, somehow putting so much resources into the details of modeling and forecasting, somehow to get the nitty-gritty details of 0.1s or 0.2s here and there, but really missing the big picture. So I think that's the very first point. And this is relevant for the next discussion about the resources. So I think the most important thing is really the ability of the board. And here I really talk about the board decision making, not a governor decision making, because this is very different. We have to keep it in mind. But I think the most important thing is that good monetary policy, in my opinion, is a co-creation exercise by the board members, where they can come up with sensible and consistent stories and narratives, make decision based on it, and then communicate it to the market. I think this is the good monetary policy. And now the motivation from moving from FPAS Mark 1 to FPAS Mark 2, I think it was clearly illustrated by Vazgen's presentation, is that in the FPAS Mark 1 world, in many cases, there's so much attention and resources which is going into the baseline forecast, into these 0.1s and 0.2s. And this is behavioral and also structural, and I'll explain why. Because behaviorally is that in that world, if you want to influence the policy making, the most important way of influencing the policy making is really influencing that one magic baseline. And that is something that I have observed consistently in many central banks, that most of the energy is really spent on making sure that the baseline is closer to the line that you have in your mind, because that is going to be so important for the policy decision making. Now, that in that world, the behavior of the board completely changes, because what happens is that you start finding the details. Forecasting becomes very, too important, and instead of being imaginative and really talking about the risks, what happens is 90% of the time you talk about this one baseline, and it's not very productive in my opinion. And then the 10% of the time, the risks and other stuff is really is just the residual, usually mechanical, only marginal changes of the baseline. At least this is my experience when I with many central banks that I have worked in my previous capacities, and also when I look at so I think the key thing that we wanted to do is really to change the mindset and making sure that the board really thinks about it. Has to be a system which forces the board not to fall in a tunnel vision, but really think about scenarios. At the same time, if you open up the discussion, this game where you have to influence the baseline, because that's the only way you can influence the policy making, that's not the dynamics there anymore. So it's actually much more cooperative. And this is something that we conjectured 2-3 years ago. But at this point, I can also attest, given our experience, that this has totally changed the dynamics and the trust. Now, I think, and the last thing, sort of connected to the title of today's seminar in terms of the Fed, and the risk management in general, I think, the key question is, how are the central banks really making their decisions? Because I don't think we want to just make up stuff because we want to be in the news and, do something new, right? I think the key insight is to improve policy making. And if you listen to the Fed, if you listen to the Bank of England, if you listen basically all the big central banks, arguably you can hear the word, risk management much more. And you can see that in most of the time, risk management considerations have been at the center of the decision making. So for me as an observer, it is now almost a fact that in the rooms internally, banks are actually making the decisions in this manner. So if you accept this point, and I'm very interested to hear Charles' view on this, if he agrees on this or not. But if you accept this, that this is how the policy is really made in the room, the key question is, how do you transparently communicate it? And I think the key question about FPAS Mark II is we've basically found a way, in my opinion, to transfer that reality into the market and communicate in a consistent way. If some central bank doesn't do this is a point that I sort of iterate during all the seminars, if a central bank does not make decisions based on this kind of risk management considerations, they don't need to adapt the FPAS Mark II or anything like that. I would, of course, argue that risk management considerations are the most important, at least right now. That's a different question. But so I think this is the real big question. If you do the risk management How do you communicate with the market? And I think this is, a very, very important thing. Now, if you look at the staff, my last point before I, give it back to you, if you look at the staff, the basic premise of what I was saying is, first, differentiate what is important, what is less important. In our opinion, in this framework, what was the most important is really engagement of the staff with the board, with the consistent narratives, doing the work, underlying the sources of the uncertainty, making sure you put a structure on the taxonomy of the scenarios, and then picking what would be the relevant scenarios to communicate with the market. Because market needs to know, okay, what will happen if this particular scenario, the thinking of the policymaker, that's what we need. If you do that in that way, in that particular case, you need less people because you don't spend so much time on the 0.1s and 0.2s, but you really spend time on the essence. I'll stop here, but I'm happy to elaborate more on the AI and the more of the specialization issues.
I think if I could just respond to that a little bit, as a teacher of someone that taught many central banks up past Mark 1, there was a lot of folly in it. We would have to teach them that here's a linear model. And obviously there's a lot of problems with any model and so on. So that's a reason for adding judgment and so on. But then at the end of the day, could you really call that the most likely thing, particularly when you would be negotiating in a room? Many people would effectively have stronger voices and stronger personalities and so on. And at the end of the day, the people that had the strongest views were always trying to, push their ideas and stick it in the baseline. And then at the end of the day, call it the most likely scenarios. So I think there was just a folly in some of the things we were doing in Mark 1. And by simply eliminating those things, I know as a teacher, just teaching and thinking about the economics and how you do this is just so much easier when you eliminate a lot of that folly. But Voskin, do you agree with that, or do you understand?
Yeah,
that this folly was creating a problem and communication issues, and when you involve it in very large groups and so on.
Yeah, every time Armen was mentioning these 0.1s and 0.2s, I actually was remembering some days that we were working in these baselines and so on, for example, 5-6 years ago. And I just remember these 0.1 and 0.2 cases, for example, which could take you I don't know, couple of days even, and 3 days, 4 days to analyze, to come up with exact numbers and so on. But as Armen also said, that's not the essence of the monetary policy. That's not the beauty of the monetary policy. And so getting rid of this kind of time-consuming exercises, I think, the best way is to concentrate much more on the essence, on the scenarios, on the communication, and so on.
So that was wonderful briefing. But back to the question, should the Fed adopt FPAS Mark II? And it's kind of interesting because it's called the prudent risk management approach to monetary policy. And that all those ideas go back to Alan Greenspan in his famous speech in 2004 and so on. But if you actually went back to 1994, you could argue in his congressional testimony that where he was defending raising the policy rate, saying that if inflation's not rising, so people were asking him, why am I raising the interest rate? And he said, well, because the unemployment rate's 6%. Historically, when unemployment has fallen below 6%, growth was really, really high. So everybody knew the unemployment rate was going to fall below 6%, but inflation was still low. And he said, the reason I'm raising the interest rate is that I don't know for sure that inflation is going to rise. The empirical evidence suggests that it will, but the reason I'm raising it is that failure to not raise the interest rate might put us in a very difficult position where we might lose our credibility, inflation expectations ratchet up, and so on. And so, as a result of that, but if I'm wrong, this was very important. So, this is very much least regrets policies, the way that we practice it now, was that, if inflation doesn't rise and the unemployment rate continues to decline, there's the natural rate falls, then I'll cut interest rates and so on. So that, all of the ideas that we're employing here, Charlie, actually we got from the Fed, and specifically Alan Greenspan, that talked about least regrets policies and started applying them. And then, by his 2004 speech, I think he was starting to talk about them explicitly. But we have a new student. Where is she? Her name is Anna.
I'm here.
Oh, there she is. So Anna has been with us a month.
A month.
Yeah, okay, 4 weeks. So please take us through the next set of questions about should the Fed adopt FPAS Mark II?
Thank you. I have a few slides, so I'll share my screen as well. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. I'm Anna. As Doug mentioned, this is my 4th week at the Central Bank of Armenia and the Global Forecasting School. And the reason why I mentioned this is because, as I typically warn before most of my presentations, my ideas should be taken with a grain of salt because I'm new. But nonetheless, I'm sincerely thankful for this opportunity to speak, and I hope that this reflects that at the Central Bank of Armenia, there is ongoing investment in human capital. In fact, as part of this investment, it is recognized that that to form a better understanding of FPAS Mark II, it is best to see it in action. And this is why we have the Not the Tealbook series, where we engage in a thought experiment by applying Mark II to the context of non-FPAS and FPAS Mark I central banks. And we think about how Mark II might operate under a variety of institutional arrangements. And the idea, as Doug mentioned, is that it's rather difficult to do monetary policy and to develop monetary policy frameworks at the same time. So we take the opportunity to take other countries' central banks as laboratories in the process of further developing this framework. Now, the goal of the Not the Tealbook exercise is to produce a streamlined monetary policy note, which might contain a set of recommendations. Although the word recommendations is quite strong because we recognize that advanced central banks are complex institutions with complex history, and some things are easier said than done. But my colleagues and I are currently individually working on our Not the Fed Tealbooks and producing our own sets of recommendations. What I expect is that there might be disagreement on how the Fed should achieve FPAS Mark II and in what time frame this could be done. But I expect a consensus on the idea that the Fed should adopt FPAS Mark II for the very reasons that Doug and Vazgen have put forward, not the least of which is that FPAS Mark II offers a transparent system capable of managing risks and uncertainty through scenarios. Okay, the second thing to consider is that the Fed should maybe publish FPAS Mark II projections. Now, the Tealbook itself is quite technical, and it would likely cause communication challenges, as Doug mentioned. But there could be a streamlined Tealbook that would be more intelligible for various audiences, including the general public. And there's plenty of room for debate in this area. One could argue that the charts that are currently included in the Tealbook might be better suited for a technical appendix. On the other hand, it can also be argued that a well-streamlined Tealbook or a good monetary policy report should be concise in its content, which implies that the charts can be presented as part of a separate, more technical document. In fact, Ben Bernanke has made a similar point in a recent proposal for the Thomas Lobach Research Conference, where he suggested that the Fed should introduce quarterly economic review released alongside the post-meeting statement and before the press conference. The review would be broadly analogous to the monetary policy reports published by many other central banks. And according to Bernanke, it would include a structured baseline forecast developed by board staff, as well as background on economic and financial developments and summaries of alternative policy rules. And crucially, it would also make space for alternative scenarios, helping to clarify the committee's reaction function and to make uncertainty a more explicit part of the Fed's public communications. The idea is that the attempt to achieve better communication is inherently consistent with the FPAS approach because it directly aids the achievement of transparency. And I've saved the most controversial slide for last. Here the argument is that to ease the process of communication, there should be a chief economist responsible for addressing analytical questions and a chairman responsible for policy-related questions. And I say that this was controversial because when I initially presented this idea to my colleagues, particularly those colleagues who have been involved in the production process at the CBA, my initial wording implied that the scenarios are somehow owned by the staff and that the chief economist speaks on their behalf. But in reality, the scenarios are constructed by the staff through a collaborative process with the board, stemming from what Vazgen has already explained. There are monitoring sessions where the staff answers the 3 core FPAS questions, thereby providing risk and uncertainty analysis. And then the board engages with these potential risks and sometimes expresses concerns that might not have been captured in the initial analysis. The board then describes their fears in a more narrative form, so not technical scenarios, but concerns and intuitions based on experience and judgment. And the staff then works to translate those concerns into structured scenarios, but only if they meet a set of criteria. They have to be related to data, they have to be realistic, and they have to be relevant for monetary policy. So it's very much a two-way process, but what's important here is that the staff provides the analytical foundation and the board brings in a different layer of judgment and priority setting. And together they arrive at a set of plausible policy relevant scenarios that can inform decision making. So thank you. I will stop here and I'll now hand it back over to Dev.
Thank you, Anna. So I think, Charlie, I'm sure that you have a bunch of questions and comments and so on. So if you just want to, do you have a list of them and which ones, perhaps you could tell us what you might have in terms of, we have a few questions from the audience as well, but please, Charlie.
Sure. Yeah, no, this is very interesting. I've not been a consumer of the FPAS taxonomy to date. It is very interesting. And, when you say that, a lot of it goes back to Alan Greenspan, that immediately gets my attention because, I've watched Alan Greenspan for a long time. And I think that, his insights on monetary policy have really been important for everybody. I think, I'm not going to be able to dive into too many details because there's just so many that I don't really, appreciate fully. But let me just let me just get at it, this way. I mean, in some sense, I think a lot of this is about what does any particular central bank need to establish its credibility so that it can achieve its mandated objectives for the country, the people, markets, and all of that. And I think it varies depending on the country, depending on the history of the central bank, and that's part of this. If I think about the U.S. experience with high inflation, Doug, you mentioned Canada and New Zealand. Well, the United States had their own high inflation experience in the 70s, and it was done in a very in some sense ad hoc, not a disciplined model guided analysis, per se, but it was like Paul Volcker coming in and doing, what central bankers have tended to do over, long periods of time, which was just, provide restrictive policies in order to get inflation under control. The entire experience in the United States from that 1979 period until inflation got arguably to a 2% objective, I call it 2003. It was a long process. Volcker got inflation down from double digits, but when he handed it over to Alan Greenspan in 1987, inflation was 4%. And I learned from Paul Volcker many, many years later, his preference was actually 0, but he never said that. And he handed over inflation was, higher than he liked. Alan Green wanted to get it lower, and they worked over a long period of time and got it down to 2%. But it was very much on a cycle by cycle basis. The next recession helped get inflation down, but they were basically following, output-based policy making, where they wanted to get inflation down, but they wanted to smooth the economic cycle as best they can. So, from this, I sort of come down on what is it that helps provide the most credibility to a central bank, and what are the needs of the central bank. And so I think the journey for FPAS Mark 1 and Mark 2, I think, is a very interesting one, as I heard it in the presentation, from the initial emphasis on sort of getting a baseline assessment in play aligned with the objectives that the central bank have, to one where, no, it's more scenarios and emphasizing uncertainty so that everybody appreciates, what works and what doesn't work. That seems to be, really, really important. So, for the kinds of things that I wrote down under credibility, what problem is being addressed with a framework? Is it a good performing central bank experience, and you're trying to tweak it and, get it to a better place? Something that's going to meet the objectives of the central bank. In the U.S., it's a dual mandate to promote maximum employment and price stability. Is it one where there's an inflation problem? And I think that's the New Zealand and Canada examples. Is it an own central bank provided inflation through overly accommodated monetary policies, or is it sort of a fiscal issue that promoted that and some kind of accommodation by the central bank that needs to be addressed? Or perhaps it's an overly restrictive monetary policy setting. I mean, if I think about Europe in 1990 with the unification of Germany and the extremely restrictive policies that the Bundesbank pursued in order to allow the demand that was taking place and rein that in, and all the other countries that were following the Deutschmark, and how difficult that was, and then eventually they broke. Is that part of what is being dealt with? So I think that the episode is very important. I think that success breeds more success, and so gaining more credibility for the central bank allows you to take on more of what you're talking here. There's just an awful lot of things that I like about what you're talking about here. Least regrets for the monetary policy decision. I really, I subscribe to that strongly. If you want to get really technical, maybe this would be a robust control, optimal monetary policy thinking that takes you into a lot of models and difficulties there. But that basic insight, I think, is a really important one that you captured here. This is something that I advocated in the U.S. while I was part of the FOMC back in 2011 through 2014, where the Fed ultimately pursued threshold forward guidance. And, this was a case where, markets were pricing in potential rate increases at a time where, inflation was still very low and unemployment was high. And so by pursuing threshold forward guidance and saying the funds rate's going to stay at 0, at least until the unemployment rate falls below 6.5%. Or, and this is the part that I always said in my speech, that I could be wrong. I could be wrong about this. And if inflation got up to, say, 2.5%, that would be surprising to me. And then we'd need to think about readjusting policy. So I think that, that broad discipline in trying to pursue, these more difficult policy decisions at certain points in time, is important. I think a lot of this, really comes down to, when you've got a difficult time for an economy and a country, what is it that the central bank is able to achieve? How difficult is it? Does the framework help facilitate that? And how often does that happen? And then other times it's like, well, it's a little easier. Most of what we're talking about would be a routine kind of preparation and meetings. So those are some thoughts that come to mind. I'm happy to drill down on anything you like.
So it'd be really, if we could just start with the credibility one. Stan Fisher, I once heard him say that when people focus too much on credibility, they might end up doing the wrong thing. What he always suggested is you try to do the right thing, and then you'll be rewarded with high levels of credibility. So just to review the experience of the inflation targeting central banks, it's pretty clear that central bank independence, without that, and very much related to that, there's de facto and de jure central bank independence. At the end of the day, the central bank has to deal in the real world, and particularly if there's fiscal dominance, then it's almost impossible to have a credible monetary policy framework that's going to commit to low inflation and so on. But I think you put those things aside, you assume that they're satisfied. You still have to have central bank performance. So credibility is just a stock. It evolves over time. It takes time. Once people have experienced high inflation, it just takes time for them to get confidence in it again. And then it gets kind of weird because it's like they don't care about it anymore. When inflation gets low enough, I remember, throughout my whole career as an economist, when we'd have discussions with people in the union and so on. And when inflation was high, we would always be talking about inflation and inflation expectations and blah, blah, blah. And then all of a sudden we went through the great moderation, and you'd be talking to the Germans and say, we got to get those wages up. They don't even seem to embed inflation expectations. They'd lost the terminology of inflation expectations and said, who cares? We're making high wages. We're doing really, really well. So there's something very interesting going on there that we have to understand and somehow incorporate. But that would be my response to credibility. When you actually look at it, there was some empirical evidence by Andy Levin and co-authors that were done at the Fed board, and they basically looked at all the countries and divided them into inflation targeting and non-inflation targeting, and the Fed was non-inflation targeting in the sample. And so they took the yield curve and broke it into a daily yield curve and broke it into all the information that would drive short-term inflation expectations, and then asked, does that get transmitted into longer-term inflation expectations in the bond market? They found that for the Fed, that was the case. And it was also the case that when there was a surprise movement in the Fed funds rate, that long-term inflation expectations would then ratchet down. So the long end wasn't as anchored as in the inflation targeting central banks, where long-term inflation expectations were very close to the target, but did not depend on information that drove short-term inflation expectations around. So there was a little bit of evidence that suggested that inflation targeting worked better at anchoring. And I think from that whole experience of the inflation targeting central bank starting in 1990 and developing that up until the Great Moderation, you might even argue that some of their performance was better during the global financial crisis and so on. So, but when it comes right down to it, the Fed, I think, was trying to do the right thing. And when you look at the experiences broadly, just in a graph, you wouldn't really see very much. And when you look at the experiences through COVID, when they really were challenged with stagflationary shocks, in my view, it was too slow. If they would have had Mark II, that financial markets would have started adjusting rates up faster, and that might have prevented medium-term inflation expectations ratcheting up a bit. But when you look at financial markets, long-term inflation expectations, they seem to have stayed pretty well anchored and so on. So, but I think the reason I think the Fed should do this, Charlie, is that all the trouble that we had for years and years and years, when we would be talking to people and they'd be saying, well, if this is such a good idea, why isn't the Fed doing it? So I'm not referring now to FS Mark II, but I'm referring to FS Mark I. And I think, when you listen to the speech by Bernanke, for example, that reviewed that experience, he basically says that the U.S. was a laggard in transparency. And so I like to ask questions, and Larry Summers, this is what he's been recommending that our students do, that we go back in history and ask, how the world would have been different if we would have had this different type of monetary policy regime. So FS Mark II, let's suppose that the Fed would have adopted inflation targeting in 1990, and we still experience a global financial crisis, but with a numerical target. If we were in, say, 2009, for those of you that forget, I'm sure Charlie remembers it very vividly, but 2009, we had double-digit unemployment, and we had inflation below, let's assume they would have had a 2% target starting in 1990. Inflation would have been below that 2%. And so any framework, which of course the Teal book, we now have and can see what was being communicated. The policy rate was at the floor for a very long time, while financial markets, the expected path of the Fed funds rate was lifting off and returning to what their estimates of the neutral rate were much, much, much faster than what would be consistent with a dual mandate central bank that cared about unemployment, that cared about inflation being below the target. And so the optimal policy in that kind of setting would be to stimulate like hell, to try and get the economy away from potentially getting stuck in a low inflation trap, which is precisely what the euro area did. They failed to get long-term inflation expectations, even up all the way to COVID, beyond 1.5%. And so that was a vulnerability that was demonstrated during COVID, where the first phase of the shocks were contractionary, inflation was falling, and everybody cut rates as much as they could. But obviously the Europeans had less space to cut rates because they had failed to get inflation up to the target and stuff. So do you like this whole idea that Larry Summers has about going back in history and rethinking how the world would have worked under these different frameworks? Because that's what we're trying to do. And do you have any advice on any particular episodes that you think that would be interested to look in?
Well, I mean, I guess I haven't followed exactly what Larry Summers' prescription has been. I would just say that there are researchers at universities doing exactly work like that all the time. And, you can argue over what they, come up with and how much you like it. But people are, working on that. If it's the idea that, the central bank itself should be doing, I mean, there's all kinds of analyses that are done. I think, if you think about, central banking at some point was a lot easier in the 80s and in the 90s because real interest rates were higher. When Alan Greenspan in 1994 started raising the funds rate, and he had to explain why he was raising the funds rate as you went through, and that was a very good description. The unemployment rate, natural rate of unemployment, was thought to be a lot closer to 6% back then, and so that would be, inflationary. He raised rates before the Fed saw inflation, really. He looked at the Institute for Supply Management Supplier Delivery Index, and he didn't like what that looked like and thought inflation would come. We really never did get that inflation. But the real crux of the matter was the funds rate had been at 3% for quite a long time, since September of 1992. And as far as he was concerned, that was the effective lower bound. They weren't going to go below 3%. And so obviously you had to come off the floor, and that's really, what was happening. Well, that's when it was 3%. Then back in 2003, the Fed ran into 1% as the effective lower bound. They weren't going to go below 1%. And then they get to 2008 and they go all the way to 0. So, I mean, if you really are committed, however you want to describe it, inflation targeting, or it's at 2%, this is what I want to do. I had a lot of colleagues who were kind of like, we don't need to do those asset purchases. We've already done too many asset purchases. The funds rate's at 0. The threshold forward guidance was all about convincing markets that we were going to continue to be at the funds rate for quite some time, even though the FOMC in June of 2011 had communicated exit strategies for getting out of our large balance sheet, which signaled to everybody that the funds rate was going to go up. I mean, there wasn't a committed consensus among committee members to keep the accommodation going. And it's just every September we learned that more needed to be done. And then we did open-ended QE3 in September of 2012. So it's a lot harder when you're at the effective lower bound. ECB didn't come around to that until finally 2014 and 15 after many missteps. And, you have a number of potential policymakers thinking, central banks shouldn't be doing asset purchase at all. So you really have to rethink. And that's another part of credibility in central banks and what the right approach to policy is. You have to be nimble-minded. Is this a period where, there's a risk that real interest rates are low, R star is low, or is it a period where R star is higher? And, thinking through scenarios, quite useful, kind of bound the possibilities for where policy is likely to be going. So you can have in mind that I want to hit my inflation objective and I want to continue to smooth the economic cycle as best I can. But at some point it does become challenging and everybody's got to put their best policy forward, make choices.
OCHAR has an interesting question, and I think it would take us into the whole issues that Vosgen was talking about, and that what is the frequency? So I want to ask his question a little bit more generally, OCHAR, so we can talk about everything. But what is the desired frequency of a monetary policy report? So currently, Vosgen, you have it 4 times a year in Armenia and so on. And I think, that was partly under FPAS Mark 1, because under FPAS Mark 1, I wouldn't want to do it every fixed action date, which usually are 8 times a year and so on. And so that means that in Armenia, what you do is you publish the monetary policy report 4 times a year. And then you have this very nice document, which is effectively the summary that's published when you don't have a full monetary policy report. But OTAR was talking about meeting with the board and so on once a week, and he thought that might be OTAR. You can speak for yourself here, but he thought that might be too frequent in the chat line. But we could open up, with AI. I'm developing AI. And the things that I'm seeing working with the students is amazing. An experienced person's productivity goes up somewhere between 4 and 10 times. An inexperienced person, things can deteriorate drastically. And I think that really points to the 6-person team and making sure that you've done enormous amounts of filtration and testing to make sure that that 6-person team can do the job. Because when you give them AI and when it's developed and deployed in a responsible way, we'll be able to do things much faster than we could think about doing them in the past. But Otar, can you your question was about just 1 week meetings with the board was too much. Is that correct?
Oh, yes. Thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation. And as always, great. You went with great speakers. Yeah, so maybe that was on a technical side, just maybe it was just comment rather than a substantial question. But yes, I mean, if probably overall, if you do something too frequently, maybe that doesn't help at the end of the day. Yes, so maybe good example is when I was supervisor. So we gave up looking at banks on a monthly basis because if you look at something too frequently, then maybe you're losing big picture. Yes, that was more comment rather than question. I do have a question on the credit growth, but probably I'll ask it later. Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, so maybe I ask Armen and Charlie and Vosgan and Anna as well. Okay, because this has implications for you, Anna, because you're the future. Do you think that we should have, instead of our quarterly monetary policy reports, whether or not we should have 8 of them, one for every action date? Armen. So this is the book.
Yes, I'll answer the questions, maybe also to respond to Otar. Otar, very good to see you. And then, but I have later on, I want to react also on the question on the robust policy, because I think in FPAS Mark II, that's the essence. So I'm going to be very persistent in, bringing on that point. I think, I think in terms of the weekly meetings, I think the point is that this is a weekly monitoring meeting where the staff takes the thematic, like what is the latest data, and so they keep everybody up to date. So these are like a very dynamic meetings where the point is, if you water down these details part in the monetary policy cycle meetings. Okay, so you still need your board members to be aware of the data and all that kind of thing. So that's why a weekly basis is basically less formal. It's just a monitoring meeting that you do. That's the purpose. So far, it has been working well. It allows us to pay less attention because everybody is already up to the speed. In terms of the monetary policy report, I mean, the question: how do you answer a question? I mean, the question is if it's gonna really make the policy better. If you give one more policy report, I don't think so. In my opinion, it's not the case. In the FPAS Mark II, it would certainly be helpful if your scenarios which are relevant for your risk analysis change that frequently, right? Which has not been the case for us, but certainly in certain periods, I would agree that that would be a good idea. Otherwise, I think Otar's point that if you look at something very frequently now in this manner, then it becomes too usual for you and then you miss the points. I think I very well taken. But I think unless scenarios and, things have changed too frequently, I think you just overfeed it. So I wouldn't change that so far. But at some points, you would actually need explicitly to do this because you see something different, and some basically kinks at some reversal points that would be useful. That would be my take.
So Charlie, I just want to we want to go to the robust control. I'd forgotten completely. Can
I just say on this subject of how often should you have reports and meetings? My understanding at the Board of Governors in Washington, they basically have a briefing every 2 weeks for the governors, and the materials are shared with everyone around the Federal Reserve System, the policymakers. And so it's very much the way Armen describes it. It's information gathering, it's sharing. Yeah, sometimes because even once every 2 weeks is too often. They might have a research, kind of presentation snuck in there just to fill up time and things like that. But Ben Bernanke, in his talk about communications, I mean, he kind of said, look, there's a monetary policy report 2 times a year. It's wildly ignored. So you need to do something different. Well, I mean, you can do it quarterly, but I don't think that's going to help. You can do it 8 times. So more recently, I'm on the outside, and I've noticed that when the FOMC has a meeting, they issue a statement. I always knew that. And the first thing that I look at is this comparison of the statement, where you just look at what's different. And a lot of times the cross-outs, there's not much that's different. These monetary policy reports have the likelihood that it would be exactly the same thing. I mean, it's like what Armen said. It's like if your scenarios are the same, that's not a lot of info. What you want is information arrival. When new information comes, that's when you want somebody to speak out, or you need to have it digested. I mean, that aligns much more with the monthly reports and how they come out. So there's a great desire for more information, and it's just, saying the same thing over and over again doesn't necessarily deliver that. And so I think that's going to be a concern.
Can I beg to differ on this, because I'm coming at this from a different perspective. Okay, both you and Armen came at it from the perspective of as policymakers and so on. But if I'm thinking about it as a person on the outside, maybe somebody that's evaluating your performance, both of you, the performance of your central bank. If I had more monetary policy reports, so when I think of monetary policy transparency, I don't just think about it as the decision and the one report. I think of it as a sequence of how the central bank has been communicating over time. And when it would just give me way more data points to be able to go back and ask what were they doing in terms of their framework, and I would give you some language forward. That the reason I don't like forward guidance, right? For example, is that they would boil it down to a couple of sentences and so on, and sometimes those sentences would be that. We need to, in the case of the ECB, we need to have extreme prudence. Well, what do you just move to regular prudence? The next word. So always create. When I look at the combination, the way that you guys communicate this stuff by having these words. I think there's way too much being read into these words that they cannot adequately describe what monetary policy is. So for me, as someone that looks at monetary policy reports and tries to understand what the policymakers are actually thinking about what is going on in the economy, what the staff is going on. Plus, I think it's like our 6-person thing. It's going very, 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 very small. They're getting very, very, very productive. And I think that with AI, it's just going to be easier for them to do that sort of thing. And so I'd like to ask Otor, which one he prefers, because this isn't just a question. They both have to provide information. The way that Charlie prefers to do it is that you have just a limited number of them, and you have speeches and press conferences, things like that, to deal with the special moments. And I understand that logic totally, okay, and appreciate it totally. But from the point of view of somebody on the outside, Otor, and you're on the outside now, you're in a commercial bank. If you're thinking about doing research, trying to understand what the central bank is thinking, wouldn't you want more?
Yes. Yes. The problem is sometimes more is less. That sometimes is a problem. By the way, I guess there was a good article on with same title with Charles Goodhart, I guess, yes, on the Basel framework. Yes. So I would say it depends. Yes. Again, first of all, if you look from inside, I would. I mean, inside central bank, and I will answer as an outsider, of course, recently. So I would hardly imagine having analytical presentations on a weekly basis, because the question is then probably what is new. Yes. So I fully agree with you. It should be maybe some regularity, but also on a risk-based basis. Yes. So how it works? Yes, if you have something new. For the outsider, yes, I would say more important what is included, of course, in report. I mean, it depends, because if it's sort of too descriptive, yes, then of course it's one thing. But if it's more insightful. Then of course it's something different. Yes, and of course it's always value to basically to highlight. Highlight. I mean, what is the most important, and what is insightful? Yes. So maybe I'm saying into broad terms, but that would be my takeaway, because. In many cases, I mean, I'm a former central banker. It's maybe for me it's relatively easy to understand the central bank language, but for commercial banks, other audience, it's more difficult. Yes, it's more difficult to get at ideas, and also as you mentioned, I mean. It's always constrained. Yes. Good example on wages. I mean, why wage growth should not be good? if you talk about this publicly, you end up in disaster. Yes. So of course you have those constraints, and you know, sometimes maybe using wrong wording, but sometimes central banking becomes a sort of cosa nostra, you know, our business. So we do one thing and we communicate something else. However, there are cases, from my experience, practical experience, not necessarily from Georgia or Armenia. There are cases when, for example, businesses understand that. Yes, of course, primarily related to the exchange rate. So businesses understand that, you know, communication and actual policies are really different, and that of course impacts central bank credibility from the negative side. Yes.
And so I just wanted to say this one thing, because it's very important that I think you and Charlie understand how long it takes to read a monetary policy report. These monetary policy reports. Okay. So for experienced people like you and me, okay, we would read the executive summary. Okay. So that's easy. Okay. You get the main point. Then you would jump to like me, I like the scenario, the taxonomy of scenarios. I want to see, have they changed anything in this? And then I want to see what case A and case B scenarios that they've chosen, and so on. And then, of course, I want to read the transparency reports to find out what each board member was thinking, and so on. Like the first, that's right now 20 minutes, 20 minutes to read that. And I think so I'm not talking about a monetary policy report like the Bank of England that's full of beans and nonsense that goes on for page after page after page after page, where you have no idea what you know, where it's kind of, it could mean this to this person and that to that person. There is no focused analysis asking what are the implications for monetary policy from this analysis. So you have to realize that's what we're doing here. Okay. So you know, so it's very short. It takes almost no time to jump to the parts that I think are important for a seasoned expert. Yeah, that's not going to read the report word by word, line by line, and so on. So I think you should take a look at it. Everybody should take a look at it. I think it can be actually improved and make, like right now, maybe it takes 20 minutes for people like us to read. I think we should be able to rewrite it so it would take 15 and it would be even shorter because it would.
I think you're exactly right. I mean, I have, over many years, I've learned, Teal book comes in and you sort of flip through the pages and you kind of understand pretty quickly what the new positioning is or whatnot. I learned a long time ago that, because I don't do forecasting myself, but the people who do forecasting and they put forecasts in front of policymakers, a pretty good strategy is you put together your best forecast and you hold on to it as long as you can. You hold on, even though the data is coming in and, you might be off a little bit. You don't want to change that because you've got a coherent story and you want to talk about how the storyline continues to be coherent. An innovation in central banking seems to be putting boxes into these documents. And as you see more boxes, these are tip-offs that, oh, well, there are risks that should be folded into the next forecast. And then you finally get to a juncture where they can't hold on to that viewpoint. The storyline has changed, and now you get a new forecaster. That's information. They finally get to the point where a threshold where, they change that. So the idea that you're going to do a monetary policy report every meeting or whatnot has this tension with sort of, well, I want to maintain this forecast. If I have to tweak it all of the time, I'm going to get that wrong. Too many tweaks is not going to be a good thing. If you're going to evaluate my performance, I think twice a year, if you can't figure out what I'm doing and also the outcomes and all of that isn't so bad. I think a little bit more is probably a good thing. But, all things in good measure. And when you say that you know how to read it pretty quickly, you don't really need all of that. And policymakers are going to give you a whole tome of material just because this is what they want. Let me throw it at them. And all of that. So cutting through that and getting, I have found since I retired, looking at the Fed documents, they're way more informative than I thought when I was on the inside. You can actually see some things. And the policymaker speeches, when you put them together, are also informative. But it does require, some wading through that. Maybe AI, will have a product that'll, cut through that pretty easily. But
I have to respond. We don't have a baseline forecast anymore. Okay. So that problem has completely disappeared. So what we do is we ask, and it's a very technical question. Doesn't take any time whatsoever. What is currently priced in financial markets? So on the day that we construct that market reference scenario, we look at financial markets, look at the interest rate path, and then we find consensus forecasts that would be consistent with that type of path and stuff. So under Mark II, that baseline is dead. So in other words, there's not a lot of thinking that goes into that. Like when you think about it as something that you're trying to defend, this thing changes every day because the expected path of the policy rate changes every day. So I think that you're not quite getting our Mark II because all that stuff is dead. The baseline's gone.
I saw that emphasis on the market expectation, but the market's pricing everything. And so you've got unconditional, you've got that mishmash of everything, as opposed to your scenarios, you'd kind of want here, what's the price of, the accommodative path? What's the price of the restrictive path or whatnot? You're saying you disentangle those combinations? That seems to be very complicated.
Yes, I agree with you that it's a mishmash, and at the end of the day, it's kind of an approximation, and so I agree with that entirely. But it's just meant to be a reference path, so that when you produce a different scenario, case A, that's significantly different from what's priced in financial markets. So in other words, none of these scenarios are things that we expect the economy to follow. There's a zero probability of that happening. So we have to first educate people on that kind of problem.
So in the US, the Fed has advertised their FRB US model and they publish it and it's out there and market people are using that to do some of these alternative scenarios. And so when you sort of look at that market expectation, and then if you can figure out the weighting of who's the marginal investor driving all of that, but they've got some of the Fed modeling in there too. That's a really complicated fixed point, problem. And then on the day of the meeting, they're trying to figure out what the policymakers are going to choose too. So, if I know the model, and you give me a policy path, and I don't worry too much about forward-looking rational expectations problems, which are a problem, then I can do, gradient analysis off of that with different, possibilities. So I think markets can handle that.
Hey, good. And unfortunately, we've gone a little bit over time, but I would like to thank everyone, Charlie in particular, as well as Anna, our future. Thank you very much for your presentation, and Armen, your interventions are always appreciated. And thanks again, Vosgen. And he's the guy that has to do all the work around here. So I guess we should thank him extra special. Okay, so thanks. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Very interesting.
Thank you.
Carlos, thanks for joining.